This is episode 101 of That Shakespeare Life. This episode is brought to you in part by Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation App, the only audio Shakespeare pronunciation app which is designed to remove fears about how to speak Shakespeare's language so that his plays are accessible to everyone. Find out more about this app in today's show notes and stay tuned after the episode for how you can learn more.
Hi, I'm James Lowland, the director of the Shakespeare at Wyandotte program at the University of Texas. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
These two men were in close contact with each other, and they share the same circles of friends and acquaintances. They were both friends of Samuel Daniel, of Philip Sidney, of Ben Jonson. They began under the same patron, Robert Dudley. They finished with the same patron, William Herbert. Florio bequeathed his library to the Pembroke family. They even had the same patron in between, Henry Wriothesley. John Florio lived at Titchfield with Henry, and he dedicated his works to Henry.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
The term hand and a half sword is often used in reference to the longsword, but it's not a historical description of the weapon because there's no evidence of this term being applied to longswords during the Middle Ages when the longsword saw its heyday in popularity as a military weapon and was widely used. And that's not just the English language. There's no reference to hand and a half sword in English or other languages before the 16th century. The term appears during the life of William Shakespeare. So what happened during the life of William Shakespeare? Why is that term appearing at this very moment to describe a weapon that never went by that name when the weapon was popular? It seems that fencing language, and indeed the English language as a whole, was heavily influenced by a man whose greatness is often eclipsed by that of Shakespeare and Jonson. The man is John Florio. Words like hand and a half sword are just one example of the power of John Florio's contributions to the English language, but it seems he also directly contributed to early modern plays themselves, including the works of Ben Jonson and William Shakespeare. He's credited in print by Jonson personally, and he's praised and sponsored by people like Salviolo, Henry Wriothesley, Philip Sidney, and other prominent figures from the 16th century. John Florio operated at the highest levels of English society and forever changed the landscape of theater and indeed the very words we use today. Here this week to share with us the unique and often overlooked life of John Florio, how he came to be in England, and the unlikely friendship he seems to have had with Ben Jonson and William Shakespeare is our guest, Marianna Iannaconne. Marianna Iannaconne is an independent researcher with a master's degree both in foreign languages as well as literature and drama. She studied in both Italy and London, and while she speaks Italian as her native language, she also knows English, Spanish, and French. Today's interview will be conducted in English. She has studied in drama and screenwriting, with her latest short film about John Florio premiering at Brigham Young University in Idaho. She attended the John Florio event at the Globe Theatre in Rome, Italy, as a speaker on the connection between John Florio, Giordano Bruno, and William Shakespeare. She is the administrator of Resolute John Florio, the website dedicated to the life and history of John Florio. Find out more about Mary in today's show notes. Before we dive into this week's episode, I want to tell you about our Experience Shakespeare Digital History Activity Kits. These activities are digital kits you can download that let you take a piece of Shakespeare's history and try it out for yourself. They're like science labs for history. Each one coordinates with a podcast episode here on That Shakespeare Life, and it's designed to be completed with items you can easily purchase at a local market or may already have at home. They explore games, recipes, dances, and more that appear in Shakespeare's plays, and after teaching you about the history of that topic, these kits offer you a video tutorial and step-by-step instructions so you can try it out for yourself. Learn more about the kits and the bonus material that's included, and you can even become a member to have one of these kits sent to you each month at CassidyCash.com/experience. That's CassidyCash.com/experience. Hello, Mary. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Cassidy.
How did John Florio first come to England?
John Florio was born in London in 1553. His father was Michelangelo Florio, who was a Franciscan friar who converted to Protestantism. And for this reason, he was imprisoned by the Roman Inquisition for 2 years. But he managed to avoid execution by escaping from prison. And he moved first to Venice, and then he moved to England. And in London, he began working for Lord Berkeley, and who appointed Michelangelo to the Italian Protestant Church in London. He was tutor to Lady Jane Grey, the Queen of the 9 Days. He was also tutor to young Queen Elizabeth I too. He was an important Protestant reformer, and John was born in London. But when he was about 1-2 years old, they had to escape because Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, ascended to the throne, and Catholicism was restored. So they had to escape, and they came back to Italy. And John spent his childhood in Soio, which now is in Switzerland. It's a little village in the mountains. And he was formed by his father. Michelangelo was a very erudite man with a vast knowledge of the Bible. So John grew up in a very religious environment. And when he was about 10, 12 years old, he was sent to Germany by his father to study in a college in Tübingen. And then he came back to England at about 18 years old because it was again a Protestant country under Queen Elizabeth I. And he got in contact with all the people his father worked with. So with Lord Berkeley and the Dudley's family.
So while John Florio was connected to England and moved back there on purpose, was it common for Italians in general to be coming to England because of the situation there with the Roman Inquisition? Was there a lot of movement from Italy to England in the 16th century?
Yeah, immigration was due mainly to religious persecutions. There were many friends of John Florio who escaped from Italy. Florio's father, Michelangelo, escaped from the Roman Inquisition. Giordano Bruno, who was a friend of John Florio, who sadly died at the stake due to the Roman Inquisition. He traveled throughout Europe his whole life, and he lived with John Florio in London at the French embassy for 2 years. Vincenzo Saviolo, too, he was a Protestant. And there were many other friends of John Florio who did the same. Alberico Gentili, who was a professor of law at Oxford, he too was a Protestant. And England welcomed Italian Protestant, and there were also many Italian musicians who were called to work at court. For example, the Bassano family or Ferrabosco family, they were Protestant Italians who moved to England, and England welcomed Italian Protestants that enriched the English culture with their talents.
Was this also happening in reverse? Because Italy was known the world over for its theater and performance with the Commedia dell'arte and other things. Yeah. Were the English also going over to Italy to learn these things?
Yes, it was very common for the aristocracy to go to Italy, not much for the lower classes. Learn Italian language, learn Italian culture was very popular and prestigious at court. So many English nobles traveled to Italy. For example, Philip Sidney spent 1 year traveling through the cities of North Italy, from Venice to the University of Padua. Henry Wriothesley, the third Earl of Southampton, patron of John Florio, traveled to Italy as well. And we know that because John Florio published a work in 1598, A World of Words, and he wrote that Henry was not just well-versed in English, but that he also traveled to Italy. So it was very common for English nobles to travel to Italy. And in Italy was the heart of the Renaissance. And theater was an important focus of attention. Commedia dell'arte was an early form of professional theater and was very popular. It was spreading all over Europe. And we have the influence of Commedia dell'arte in English drama as well. as well as Italian authors like Boccaccio, Bandello, Aretino, who revolutionized literature and theater as well. But there was a different mood when Englishmen traveled to Italy, because sadly there was also huge racism in England towards Italians. Learn Italian language, learn Italian culture was very common, popular, and prestigious at court. But if you were Italian, you might also risk being beaten up in the street. And John Florio knew it very well. He had been meeting with adverse criticism his whole life for his Italian sympathies. There was a famous scholar, English scholar, Roger Ascham, who published a book, The Schoolmaster, in which he warned English nobles who traveled to Italy, writing that the English Italianate was a devil incarnate. There were other Florio's contemporaries who thought the same. Thomas Nash was a famous enemy of John Florio, who believed English nobles who traveled to Italy returned not just well-versed in Italian language and Italian culture, but apparently also in the vices and loose morals. So in this context, John Florio saw himself as a sort of apostle of Italian Renaissance in England, bringing the Italian culture, the Italian language to the English masses. But this wasn't always well received. That's why he was also cautious during his career, but he let nothing stand in his way. That's why he called himself resolute John Florio.
You mentioned Vincenzo Salviolo as a friend or at least a colleague of John Florio in that way. And Salviolo wrote a fencing manual in the late 1590s with descriptions and specifically terminology on fencing. Was John Florio's focus on grammar? Did they work together, you think, on that fencing manual?
Yes, Salviolo published fencing manual in 1595 titled Vincenzo Salviolo, his manual, his practice in 2 books. And it's structured as a dialogue between Vincenzo Salviolo and his student. It was the first manual on fencing to be available in the English language. The first book is about the use of the rapier and the dagger. The second book is about quarrels, honorable quarrels. And if it's important to say that the second book of Salviolo is more of an English translation of an Italian book by Girolamo Muzio titled Il Duello. And there are also many illustrations in the manual made by woodcuts. And Vincenzo Salviolo shows his concept on fencing, which was a mix of Italian and Spanish concept. And it interlaced with Palladian conversations. And he was a close friend of John Florio. John Florio already mentioned Salviolo 4 years before this work in his second Fruits. And it's likely that John Florio helped Vincenzo Salviolo writing this book because there is something important to say. John Florio was an exception, but usually Italians didn't write in English for a very simple reason. English was a language that was still at its earliest stage, was a language that was still developing. The official language was still Latin. At court, ambassadors talked to each other in French or Italians. So Italians, as John Florio say in his first work, First Fruits, English was a language that passed over, was worth nothing. It's weird to believe it today, but at the time, English was still developing. So Italians didn't write in English. John Florio was an exception. And for this very reason, it's likely that Vincenzo Salviolo wrote the treatise in Italian and John Florio translated in English. Also, the fact that the second book of Salviolo is basically a translation of an Italian book written by Girolamo Muzio, it makes you understand that actually someone translated the book from Italian to English for Salviolo, and that man is John Florio. So, as usual, John Florio worked as an editor for this work. And since he worked as editor his whole life, he was an excellent editor. And so most probably he helped helped Saviolo writing this book, translating the book from Italian to English, editing and adapting the work for the English audience.
They did an incredible job of adapting the work for the English audience because this unique fencing terminology from Saviolo's treatise shows up in Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 1, which suggests there was a significant influence of the work into not just fencing terms, but the actual English language was influenced by this work. Is it possible that Florio was actually closer to Shakespeare and therefore a more likely influence on that play in particular?
Yeah, we find Saviolo fencing language in Henry IV. There are many characters who use Saviolo fencing language. One of them, John Falstaff, for example. Henry IV is not the only play which has the influence of Saviolo fencing manual. There are other plays which have this influence. For example, As You Like It. The duel between Orlando and Charles is based on Saviolo fencing manual, as well as Touchstone dialogue on the various forms of a lie is based on Saviolo's book. There's a chapter in which he describes the various forms of a lie. And John Florio was in close connection with the theater. As I said before, Vincenzo Saviolo didn't write in English. He was an Italian fencing master, after all, not a writer. And it's possible that John Florio was the link between these two worlds, between Shakespeare and Saviolo. John Florio, too, write and use Saviolo fencing language, Saviolo fencing terms in his works 4 years before Saviolo's manual. In Second Fruits, there is a dialogue in which John Florio describes Saviolo. And he borrows words from Spanish, from Italian, and he creates this new linguistic graph using words like pasada, stoccado, embrocada to give more color, to give more rhythm to the dialogue. And we find this fencing language, the fencing terms, years later in Romeo and Juliet with Mercutio. So this actually makes you understand that it was John Florio, through his connection and friendship with Vincenzo Saviolo, to serve as an influence on Shakespeare's plays in Henry IV and in other Shakespeare's plays.
In 1591, John Florio described Saviolo's fencing school as being, quote, in the little street where the well is at the sign of the Red Lion. How close was Saviolo's fencing school to somewhere like the Globe Theatre? Were these in close physical proximity?
Yes, it was very close. When Saviolo arrived in London, he went to work at Rocco Bonetti's fancy school, which was in Blackfriars. So we can safely say that Saviolo was in and around Blackfriars. Then when Bonetti died, he decided to manage the school with a friend, Geronimo. And it wasn't far from the Globe. You had to walk through Thames Street, cross London Bridge, and then you end up in Southwark, where the Globe was. So I think it must have been about 20, 30 minutes walk, more or less.
Why was John Florio writing and describing the fencing school at all? Where was this published that he was talking about this?
John Florio published a work in 1591, Second Fruits. Second Fruits is a bilingual language lesson manual in Italian and English, and it's structured in dramatic dialogues. It's important to say that John Florio differs very considerably from other Protestant refugees who kept school in London in the 16th century. Florio didn't write language lesson manual for school children or beginners. He aimed rather at the nobility, at the aristocracy. The themes of his works, of First Fruits or Second Fruits, are about women, are about love, are about poetry. For example, in Second Fruits, we find the first sonnet in the English language. So he wrote ambitious works, and he had a genius for catching the very spirit of the time in which he was writing. And in this context, in Second Fruits, there is a chapter 7, in which there are two characters, Giordano and Edward. They are in their chamber with a servant, and suddenly they decide to go out, to go for a walk, and they don't know what to do, and Edward suggests to Giordano to go to the fancy school. And there they see Vincenzo Saviolo. So they start to describe him. Giordano said that he's a handsome man, that he's from Padua, that his father died during the war. Edward answered that Saviolo, he has learned to play at the weapon from Saviolo. And Giordano answered that he looks like Mars himself. And they end the conversation by saying, I love him with all my heart. And I could almost hear Florio saying behind the character of Giordano. So in this chapter, John Florio describes Saviolo in details, and it makes you understand that he was a close friend of Saviolo and was in close contact with him.
With it being so closely located to the Globe Theatre, with Bonetti's school being at the Blackfriars, and this is the same Blackfriars that would go on to become a theatre later with Shakespeare and the Burbages, what other evidence is there to tell us whether or not Florio might have been close friends with English playwrights like Jonson and Shakespeare?
Well, there have been some hints in Shakespeare and Jonson biography that Florio was a close friend of both. Even if from Shakespeare scholars, this relationship, Florio and Shakespeare, has always been distorted throughout the centuries, basically giving a misleading picture of both men and writing fiction stories of Shakespeare and Florio fighting each other or hating each other, with Florio being the bad guy and Shakespeare the genius who hated Florio. I've read some really entertaining stories about that, but few of these are true. These two men were in close contact with each other, and they share the same circles of friends and acquaintances. They were both friends of Samuel Daniel, of Philip Sidney, of Ben Jonson. They began under the same patron, Robert Dudley. They finished with the same patron, William Herbert. Florio bequeathed his library to the Pembroke family. They even had the same patron in between, Henry Wriothesley. John Florio lived at Titchfield with Henry, and he dedicated his works to Henry. They shared the same official rank of groom of the privy chamber under Queen Anne of Denmark. They both had Thomas Pope as a close friend. They had the same engraver, William Hall. They had the same publisher, Edward Blunt. I mean, it's impossible not to think these two men didn't casually meet at least once in their lifetime. So there is a close connection between these two men. Shakespeare was also influenced by John Florio's works, by the dramatic dialogues of first phrase and second phrase, as well as from A World of Words and Montaigne essays that we know it was a source of inspiration, not just for The Tempest, but also for other Shakespeare plays like King Lear or Hamlet. Florio was also a passionate reader of play. He had a huge library, and he had about 40, 50 plays, comedies, tragedies, pastoral comedies, all commedia dell'arte, as well as books by Bandello, Aretino, Ariosto, Sannazzaro that we know were a source of inspiration for some Shakespeare plays. So there is a connection between these two men, and it cannot be explained by portraying them as two men fighting each other or hating each other. Most importantly, it cannot be explained by portraying John Florio, who was such a gifted writer, prized by the most important writers and nobles of the time, as the silly, boring pedant or teacher. He had a strongly marked personality. He published brilliant works, and the mudslinging that he suffered throughout the centuries was clearly done to diminish the important contribution that he gave to literature and drama. John Florio was a close friend of Ben Jonson, and he helped Ben Jonson write in Volpone. And we know that because Ben Jonson wrote a beautiful dedication for John Florio in a copy of Volpone that he gave to him, prizing him as his loving father and worthy friend, and the aid of his muses, which is a huge compliment. It makes you understand that Ben Jonson admired John Florio, that he was a close friend of him, and then John Florio helped Ben Jonson write in Volpone. He defined him the aid of his muses, which makes you understand that Florio was the aid of many other muses. And this threw a light upon the role that John Florio had in theatre. So there is a connection. It is very well documented, and it cannot be explained by portraying these two men hating each other or fighting each other, or by giving John Florio the male role of the silly, boring teacher who supplies friends of banal information about Italian folklore.
We've established pretty well that they were friends and they were connected. Obviously, the influence is there, absolutely. But I've read descriptions of John Florio that describe him specifically with the word poet. And this struck out to me because it's often a description that's applied to Shakespeare himself. And I wondered what your opinion was about how involved in theater John Florio might have been.
Mm-hmm. Well, John Florio was involved in theatre since he arrived in London. He was about 18 years old when he arrived in London. And after 7 years, we have his first work, First Fruits, which contains poems by the whole company of the Leicester's men. So actors like Richard Tarleton, Robert Wilson, John Bentley, praising him and thanking Florio for having worked with them. Volpone was published almost 30 years later, and we find Ben Jonson again praising him and thanking Florio for having worked with him. Florio spent his whole career in theatre. This is an aspect that very few scholars talk about. And he was defined many times an ingenious writer and a poet when writing and translating. Sometimes critics have pointed out that John Florio didn't really translate, but sometimes he wrote whole new books. I'll make one example. Montaigne Essays is a classic of literature. It's among the greatest work of the 7th century, up there with King James Bible. And Florio's style is beautiful. It's melodious, it's sonorous, his love for word patterns and sound patterns, the use of different languages to enrich the English language, his love for pomposity, for rhetorical ornament, for alliteration. They are all ingredients of Florio's strong style that made him genuinely a poet. And this aspect has not to be fully investigated and requires serious attention. And the fact that he has been sometimes described as the pedant or a teacher should instead open your eyes and makes you wonder that why they have tried so hard to relegate him to obscurity.
So it sounds like John Florio was much more than a writer who influenced works like Jonson's Volpone and Shakespeare's Henry IV, but instead was actively involved with these men as they were creating these plays. That's fascinating to me. I know we would love to learn more about this topic and to explore the life of John Florio further. What are some of your recommended books and resources that we should look at when we want to learn more about him?
Well, if you just want to know more about John Florio, about his life and his works, there is Francis Eates' biography, John Florio, The Life of an Italian, Shakespeare's England, that I hugely recommend because it's the most important biography about John Florio still today, even if some things are a bit outdated, but due to more recent discoveries made about John Florio. Francis Eates published his biography in 1934, so we have had more recent discoveries about his life, but it's still today the most important book and biography about John Florio. If you just want to know about the importance of foreign languages and how they enriched the English language, so the importance of Protestant refugees and the important role that John Florio had in shaping in the development of English language, I recommend John Gallagher's book, Learning Languages in Early Modern English, which gave an extensive analysis of how learning languages, foreign languages, was important for the developing of English language. And John Florio has a huge role in it. It makes you understand that he really stood out from the crowd. He really is the hero of this book. And instead, if you just want to know the influence of Florio's first Fruits, second Fruits, and of Saviolo's work in Shakespeare's plays, there is a really interesting analysis made by Rinaldo Simonini from North Carolina. The book is Italian Scholarship in Renaissance England, in which he describes in details the influence of the dramatic dialogues of first Fritz and second Fritz, as well as Saviolo's book, in Shakespeare's plays, and the relationship between Florio and Ben Jonson.
We will link to all of these resources in the show notes for today's episode, as well as to Mary's website about John Florio called resolutejohnflorio.com. So make sure you check out the show notes for links to all of these resources. Thank you, Mary. Now, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, since I really like Boccaccio's Decameron, I will bring with me the English translation that John Florio published anonymously of Boccaccio's Decameron, because I haven't read it fully, and I would like to read the whole book. So that's the book that I will choose.
That's an excellent choice. You'd be well set up there on your deserted island. I think that's a great choice. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm working on some new documents about John Florio, about the period in which he was private secretary to Queen Anne of Denmark. He dealt often with foreign ambassadors, with Italian ambassadors. So the letters and documents that he received, and about the period in which he retired and he lived in Fulham, about the period is 1623, 24, a couple of years before his death, and in which John Florio didn't receive the pension that he deserved because King James faced huge economical problems. So John Florio lived the very few years before his death with economic problems, but he was still writing, and he was still involved in some huge literary undertaking. And I'm working on documents and letters that he received in a couple of years before his death.
That's fascinating. I know we'll look forward to following your work on that. It's amazing to me that John Florio was so ambitious and came over at 18 and ended up working directly for the Queen of England. Is fascinating to me. We will look forward to exploring all of these resources. Mary, thank you so much for being here today and helping us take a look at the life of John Florio. This has been a really fun conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
To add your voice to our conversation or to look at the full transcript of today's episode, be sure to head over to the show notes. You can leave a comment, download transcripts, and each week we pack the show notes full of more history. There's images, links to resources, and information that you can use to explore this week's topic further. So if you want to find out more about John Florio, his life, his connection to Ben Jonson and William Shakespeare, as well as his time as groom of the Privy Chamber under Queen Anne of Denmark, the wife of James I, you can find all of this information on Mary, the Resolute John Florio website, and copies of First and Second Fruits, Salviolo, Blackfriars, and more at CassidyCash.com/episode 101. That's CassidyCash.com/EP101. When I first started studying Shakespeare, especially as an American, where the English language is very different on this side of the pond than where Shakespeare was writing, I often mispronounced some of the words that you find in the plays. Like originally I said Gloucester instead of Gloucester. Well, that's why I downloaded Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app. It's an easy-to-use, straightforward app that you can download to your phone or tablet on iTunes as well as Google Play. And it lets you search any word from Shakespeare, and then it tells you exactly how to say it with a playable audio guide built right in. Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app is like having a professional voice coach that you can carry in your pocket. Explore all the features of this app and download it right now at CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's it for this week. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.